Welcome to Fed by Fire, the podcast where we dive deep into flames of America's underbelly, the stories of crime, corruption, and the systems that keep the chaos burning. I'm your host, Christian Whitlow, and before we get started, I want to make a quick disclaimer. I'm not better than anyone. I've been homeless on and off all my life, and I know that struggle firsthand. And if you're going through this right now, I pray for you. This episode is not meant to glamorize or romanticize anything about that lifestyle. This is for entertainment and educational purposes only. And tonight, we're going to be exposing the deadly dance between drug traffickers and homeless encampments. Across the U.S., we'll tour the hotspots from Seattle's jungle to LA's Skid Row to Philly's Kensington to San Francisco's Tenderloin, all the hotspots and Portland's camps, and then we'll pull back the curtain on what I call the homeless industrial complex, the scam that's turning human suffering into a billion-dollar business. And let's begin in the Pacific Northwest, where the rain-slick streets of Seattle hide a shadow economy. And it's January 2025, and federal agents are closing in on a network that's been, allegedly poisoning the city's underbelly for years. At the center is Theodore Nation, a 36-year-old dealer. He was sentenced to 30 months in prison, but Nation was just one piece of a much larger puzzle. A drug trafficking organization operating out of homeless encampments like the place called the Jungle under Interstate 5 and spots in the International District. So picture this, tents clustered in the gloom under the highway overpass, where the roar of traffic drowns out the cries for help. And here the DTO sold Fetty, Ice, Blow, H directly to those living on the edge, and prosecutors called it predatory targeting, particularly vulnerable and marginalized members of communities. And U.S. District Judge Tana Lynn, he didn't mince words at Nation sentencing. He was dealing to people that were already teetering on the brink, and the investigation kicked off in November of 2023, a joint effort by the Seattle Police, the FBI, and the DEA. They zeroed in on the dealers at the hotspots like 12th and Jackson, where open-air markets blended seamlessly with encampments. It was just a regular day for them, but using wiretaps, agents overheard hints of violence and threats to rivals, plans to protect turf, and they had to move carefully to avoid, spooking the targets. Then came the January 2025 arrest, 17 firearms, seized 23 keys of Fetty, and that's enough for over 1.7 million doses. According to DEA Special Agent in Charge, Robert A. Saccone, he called it a frontline fight for a fentanyl-free America. That's something we've heard a lot about on this channel, but the operation didn't stop there. A second wave in May 2025 netted 100 pounds of ice and 101 kilos of blow and 19 kilos of Fetty powder, 250,000 inbox dirty 30s, and 4 kilos of H at a street value of nearly $3 million. And First Assistant U.S. Attorney Charles Neal Floyd, he summed it up as this defendant made a living feeding the addiction of others, making it ever more difficult for them to get out of the danger of the homeless encampments. And the stats back it up. In King County, fentanyl overdoses skyrocketed from 167 in 2020 to 1,086 in 2023, hovering around 700 in 2025, and that was part of the Homeland Security's task force under Executive Order 14157 aimed at dismantling cartels and gangs. But let's zoom out. This isn't just about the seizures, it's about the lives trapped in the cycle, the encampments like the Jungle, become an ecosystem. Dealers supply, addicts buy, and violence simmers. But residents nearby, they report the needles everywhere, the thefts spiking, and one anonymous local told reporters it's like living next to a war zone. And the DTO didn't just sell drugs, they fueled the encampment's growth, keeping people hooked and, homeless without any chance of stability. And as we wrap up this first segment, remember, Seattle's story is a blueprint, and similar networks are embedding in encampments nationwide, turning these public spaces into, private places of despair. Next, we head to LA Skid Row, where a 2-year sting exposed a ring preying on monthly assistance checks. And that is a very, start of piece of clientele that, is very vulnerable. But let's start. On the 50 block of Labrith, a tense and desperation has long been ground zero for America's homelessness crisis. Over 4,000 people live unsheltered here amid, open air markets that rival any bazaar. But in December 2021, a 2-year multi-agency operation shattered one of the area's deadliest rings, leading to 50 arrests and exposing how traffickers exploit the homeless. And the LAPD and the DEA, they targeted these dealers who timed their sales to public assistance payouts at the start of each month. Like most dealers have done forever. Like clockwork, vulnerable residents, many, of course, battling with addiction, would cash their checks and head straight to, y'all know who, the D-boy, waiting, peddling, 30s, ice, blow, H, you name it, right in the encampments. And one bust alone yielded over 46,000 dirty 30s, 5 kilos of blow, 857 pounds of ice, 5 pounds of H, 6 firearms, and 250,000 in cash. From sales, Skid Row's history, it amplifies the horror. Since the 1930s, it's been a magnet for the down and out, and the opioid surge has turned it in toxic. Encampments line the sidewalks and pop-up stands blending into drug bazaars. Residents, slumped in doorways. They inject openly while gangs control the turf. And the operation revealed, what some people would call predatory drug dealing. Traffickers using apartments as hubs to supply encampments and fence stolen goods. FBI special agent in charge noted that the ring's sophistication, they hid in plain sight, fueling overdoses that spiked amid the pandemic, and LA's unhoused population hit 75,000 by 2025, with harm reduction efforts like clean syringes clashing against the crackdowns. But the bust showed encampments as business models, and dealers, keep addicts hooked, ensuring repeat customers. While violence spills over, nearby hospitals, where patients are dumped, here is a worsening cycle. And it's a sad one, and I pray for anyone going through it. A local outreach worker described it as it's a moral crisis. Junkies injecting into cracked feet tents is what they call meth colonies. This case mirrors the Seattle traffickers embedded in encampments, turning vulnerability into revenue, but LA's scale is massive. Fentanyl alone claimed 2,100 unhoused lives from 2014 to 2023, and as we move east to Kensington and Philly, it shows how one block can become a fentanyl fortress. Alright guys, next we are going to be going to Kensington, one of America's largest open-air drug markets, blocks overtaken by collapsed figures, umbrellas shielding deals. It's a scene from a dystopia. In October 2025, the FBI indicted 33 members of the Weymouth Street drug trafficking organization, a nearly decade-long conspiracy flooding the area with Fetty, H, and blow. And this was no small-time hustle. The DTO operated from one of Kensington's most prolific blocks, using encampments as distribution points, and they devastated the communities, fueling violence and fear. And U.S. Attorney David Metcalf called it the largest federal indictment in Philly, this century, a precision missile at the opioid scourge. FBI Director Kash Patel added that we have permanently removed a DTO pouring guns and chemicals into our communities. Kensington's story starts with industrial decline, poverty, limited health care, breeding, open markets. By 2022, Philly saw 1,413 overdoses and 80% opioid-related spiked with xylazine, aka trank. Encampments under the L train became hubs, people knotted out, wounds festering. Police sweeps in 2024 reduced visible tents, but the market shifted arrests up to 23%, yet side streets filled with belongings and users, and the Weymouth crew preyed on the homeless, that being their main clientele, blending sales into encampments. And investigations revealed, tremendous volumes, with raids on homes, like the 3100 block of Weymouth, uncovering stashes. Like Seattle, it's about exploitation. Dealers keep people trapped, encampments keep growing, and as addiction deepens, one resident said it's hell. Open drug use, freezing nights, cops sweeping over 1,200 unhoused overdoses in recent years highlights the toll on just how much it's affected this community. And this bust is hailed as a model for cities, but the market persists and displacement just pushes it down the street. Next, we're going to go to San Francisco, the Tenderloin, where corner stores, hid deadly dens. And this open air market has a very long history, So we're going to cross back to the West Coast, San Francisco's Tenderloin, a gritty grid of alleys where homelessness meets high-tech wealth. In 2025, officials shut down 9 convenience stores, posing as legit businesses, but operating as drug and gambling hubs. And, these magnets for drug activity sold illegal substances, trafficked stolen goods, and harbored firearms, all tied to encampments on Willow Street and beyond. The crackdown followed complaints of open dealing, shifted by the city's efforts. Stores violated nighttime ordinances, drawing dealers and users. City Attorney David Chow, I hope I pronounced that right, said some sold drugs themselves. Extraditions of Honduran suppliers targeted nighttime markets, but alleys like Willow remained hot spots. And, privacy from busier streets allowed tents to cluster with hondos controlling supply. The Tenderloin's crisis in 2024, lawsuits accused the city of containing drugs here, with residents suing over paraphernalia distribution, attracting more activity. Encampments, ballooned, Fetty, harder to find, but deadlier when laced with other stuff. Arrests skyrocketed, tents tumbled, yet displacement cornered the problems. Like the other cases, traffickers used encampments as extensions, keeping users hooked amid sweeps. Overdoses peaked, with harm reduction clashing against enforcement. Finally, up the coast of Portland, where encampments, dot parks and sidewalks. In 2024, police raided a downtown camp, arresting 8 in a chop shop tied to drug sales. Another in February busted netted 12 after shootings in open-air use near Menlo Park. These fueled by fentanyl emergencies. Deaths, quadrupled to 450 in 2023. Camps become colonies with kids exposed to hazards. And sweeps dismantled, 20 plus daily, but networks persisted, preying on shelters like the Moore Street, turning quiet neighborhoods chaotic. But out here, everybody's making money off of the same sidewalk. You've got dealers making money off of poison. You've got people, I used to be, spending everything I had, just not to stay sick, just to make it one more day. And then you've got a whole industry of nonprofit agencies, consultants, developers, pulling in billions of dollars in the name of solving the homelessness and addiction. On the exact same block, if money fixed this, places like the Tenderloin in San Francisco and Skid Row in LA would have been clean a long time ago. And these are some of the most, funded neighborhoods in America. And when it comes to services, and still you can walk through and see open air fatty and ice use and human beings rotting in tents. So either all that money doesn't work or it's not meant to. And tonight I want to talk about something people are finally starting to name out loud: the homelessness industrial complex, and what I'm calling, the scam. The idea is that there's a system that needs people to stay homeless and addicted so the money keeps flowing. And this doesn't just mean every outreach worker is evil. Most of them are broke, burnout, and trying to help and do the right thing. But the structure on top, the executives, the developers, the political machine, makes a lot less like charity and a lot more like business. I spent 14 years in active addiction. I know what it is to be the product, the problem, and the paycheck all at the same time. And now, sober, when I look at what's happening in these encampments, I don't just see chaos, I see a business model. And let me paint you a picture of the Tenderloin. Residents and hotels actually had to sue the city of San Francisco in federal court, accusing the city of turning their neighborhood into a containment zone for narcotic activities. They describe crowds outside of their homes selling and using narcotics, stolen goods being fenced, and tents blocking sidewalks daily so badly that they were forced to walk in the street. Another complaint says the city has effectively herded Fetty users into the Tenderloin like it's a designated zone where open air drug dealing and encampments are allowed to happen. But, the same story in Skid Row. One report estimates more than 12,000 homeless ice and H addicts, pass through that area every year, and that the drug trade there is just in ice, H, and blow. It's something like a $200 million annual business. Addiction itself is described as a booming business on those streets. So, on one side of the block, you've got this underground economy, the drugs, the stolen goods, hustle. On the other side, you've got, the official economy, billions in government and philanthropy money meant to address homelessness, billions in tents. Still, it's not an accident, that's an incentive problem. And I remember being that guy in active addiction. Every system around me, jail, court, certain rehabs, the treatment, they all made money off me, staying in that cycle. The longer I stayed sick, the more services I used, the more they got paid, and nobody got a bonus when I actually got my shit together. Now zoom out and apply that to an entire neighborhood. Let's talk numbers. Cities like Los Angeles and San Francisco have poured staggering amounts of money into homelessness. One analysis of the homeless industrial complex points out that Americans spend billions through taxes, money from me and you, and donations to combat homelessness. But a significant slice of that money goes not into housing or treatment, but into political activism overhead and organizations that fight policies which might actually reduce street encampments. A California policy paper describes how this works. Developers accept public money to build, bridge housing or permanent supportive housing. Cities collect the fees and expand the bureaucracies to oversee it. Once the projects are built, nonprofits get long-term contracts to run them. And that sounds fine on paper until you look at outcomes. In California, one pioneering homeless nonprofit helped design a big housing program, won around $114 million in state grants to acquire and convert motels into housing for homeless. But, people then left behind a trail of failed projects, foreclosures, and empty buildings. Meanwhile, thousands still lived in tents. So think about that. You can fail, lose buildings, and still have already collected the grants and contracts. The people who were supposed to be housed, back to the sidewalk. And at the same time, watchdogs and critics, they point out that some nonprofits in this space are pulling in billions of dollars collectively, with executives making comfortable salaries while frontline staff, often formerly homeless themselves, are working near minimum wage in underfunded, chaotic shelters. And the pattern is simple. Money is measured in dollars spent and programs launched. Success is measured in reports, activism, and court briefs. Almost nobody is held to the did the encampment go away? Did people actually leave the street long term? If you're watching this from a tent, this is what, that feels like. You become the permanent justification for everyone else's paycheck. Now, let's drill into addiction, because, this is where my story intersects with what's happening in places like the Tenderloin and Skid Row. And researchers from UCSF looked at drug use among California's homeless population, and they found that about 37% had used drugs regularly in the prior 6 months, with ice being the most common at around 33%. Another chunk had used in the past, but not recently, at least they said, and about a quarter had never used drugs at all, they claimed. So it's important to say this clearly. Not every homeless person is an addict, but they also found that drug use is higher among homeless people than the general public, which of course it would be. And one advocate who's been there himself called drug addiction an anchor to the street. He said high rents and lack of housing might push people into homelessness, but untreated addiction and mental illness are often what keep them there. On Skid Row, reports say more than 12,000 homeless, ICE, and HE addicts pass through there each year, like we said earlier in the video, with thousands, left displaced, and it's just such a sad system. And, it's all fueling this massive black market. Think about that. This is a $200 million black market running right alongside a multi-billion-dollar helping industry. Now, harm reduction in the Tenderloin residents and business owners, they have said that this has a problem, and they had tolerated widespread distribution of drug kits like pipes, needles, and straws, and the city was actually attracting drug users and dealers to their streets. I think that's more of a money grab. One lawsuit accuses agencies of delivering drug kits directly to sidewalk encampments, which that's what they do here in Roanoke to stop bloodborne illness, But they called it a drug containment zone. Another complaint describes the city encouraging addicts to consume Fetty, at sanctioned sites meant to reduce overdose deaths, which I think, safe space uses are a great thing, But now that I am, clean and a father and stuff, my opinion on that might be a little biased. I might say not in my neighborhood, but I think it's a great thing. But on one hand, harm reduction groups save lives, overdose reversal, clean equipment, and supervised use can, keep people from dying before they have a chance to get clean. It did me. And on the other hand, when that's the only tool used and there's no real pipeline into treatment, housing, and long-term recovery, you end up stabilizing the street life instead of ending it. From my perspective, as someone who used for years, I knew the difference between somebody who gave me a clean needle when, walked me straight toward a real program. There's a difference, and somebody who just needed me to show up, use the service and disappear. Because, my presence helped them tick a box on a form, One is mercy, the other is management, and in those encampments, management has become the norm. And I want to be fair here, because if you work on the front lines, my hat goes off to you. You probably feel attacked every time somebody says homeless industrial complex. And most case managers, shelter workers, and outreach teams, they're not getting rich from this. People from the inside, the nonprofit world, talk about how staff are nickel and dimed every day, often formerly homeless themselves, doing dangerous work for little to no pay, while the C-suite is grossly overpaid, and there are organizations that genuinely provide shelter, meals, and detox and real help without getting involved in big money development schemes or national political campaigns. So, when I say scam, I'm not saying that every nonprofit worker is a villain. The scam is structural. Governments measure success by money spent and programs created, not by visible reductions in people, sleeping on the street. Developers and some nonprofits can profit even when projects fail or set half empty. Advocacy organizations, sometimes focus their energy on blocking policies like enforcing basic public order or linking camping to treatment. And that might actually make the street scenes shrink because it clashes with their ideology. Meanwhile, neighborhoods like the Tenderloin and Skid Row are treated as acceptable sacrifice zones where open-air drug markets and encampments are tolerated in ways that would never fly in richer, whiter areas. And residents in the Tenderloin, suing the city for letting their streets get this way, supposedly become a containment zone, aren't right-wing extremists. They're people who step over bodies and open deals just to get to work every day. And the people in the tents, they're not props for either side. They're hostages to all of it. And I can't tell you how many people I've seen die in that middle space too sick to climb out, alone, used as political talking points, and surrounded by programs that never actually grabbed them by the hand and walked them out, which you can't for nobody. That's got to be their choice. But first, you'd flip the incentives. Imagine if funding wasn't tied to how many people an agency serves, but how many people actually exit homelessness and stay off the street for at least a year. Imagine if every city had a public dashboard showing dollars and units opened, number of people permanently housed, and the actual encampment counts by neighborhoods. If you spend $100 million in a district and the tents don't go down, you don't get more money. The next cycle, you get investigated and replaced. Second, treatment on demand. That UCSF study showed a chunk of homeless people who wanted treatment but couldn't ever get it. That is insane in a state that is spending billions on homelessness. There should be real detox beds, residential treatment, medication-assisted treatment, and recovery housing available without a 3-month wait list, especially in hot spots like the Tenderloin, Skid Row. You show up, ready, you get a bed that day. Third, containment with a ladder out. I don't think you can just sweep encampments with no plan, but I also don't think it's compassionate to let people slowly die on the sidewalk in the name of, rights. One path could look like this. No long-term camping on public sidewalks in sensitive neighborhoods. Outreach plus enforcement. You can't stay here, but you are offered shelter and treatment. If you, refuse everything, there are consequences, but there are also constant chances to say yes. Fourth, but people with lived experience in charge of oversight, not just as, token peer counselors, people who've actually survived addiction and homelessness should sit on these boards, not millionaires. They should be the ones approving the funding, audit the programs, and define what success is. They know the difference between a program that changes lives and a program that just writes good reports and pockets the money. Finally, we need courage, because if we ever tie money to real outcomes, some very big, very comfortable organizations are going to lose their grip on this crisis, and that's exactly why it hasn't happened yet. And I want to end by talking directly to two groups of people. If you're in active addiction right now, watching this from a tent, from a shelter, from somebody's couch, I see you. I was you. There's a whole system that profits from you staying stuck. But there is also a way out that has nothing to do with their balance sheets. It's ugly, it's painful, it's humbling, but it's real. I'm sitting here, just a little over a year sober, not because the system fixed me, but because God, family, and a few people who actually gave a damn refused to let me die like that. And if you're a taxpayer, a voter, somebody who just drives past these scenes and feels numb, I'm asking you to wake up and ask your city one simple question. For every dollar you spend on homelessness, how many people are left on the street and stayed off it for a year? If they can answer that, or they can change the subject, you're not looking at a safety net, you're looking at a business model. And the homeless industrial complex is real, and the way it plays out on the ground in places like the Tenderloin and Skid Row is cruel. And as long as we keep pretending that this is just about compassion and not about cash, people will keep dying in the richest cities in America. My name is Christian Whitlow. This is Fed by Fire, we're going to keep talking about the stories. Everybody else is, probably getting paid to ignore. Stay safe, stay honest, and if you're still breathing, it is not too late. I'll see y'all on the next one.